Madeleine Doby. I'm the chair of the Department of French, and it's my great pleasure this evening to introduce my colleague, Antoine Compagnon, for this lecture on the Proust pandemic of 2022. Antoine Compagnon is the Blanche W. Knopf Professor of French and Comparative Literature. He has taught at Columbia since 1985, which makes him the longest-serving member of the faculty of the Department of French. He's also Professor Emeritus of Modern and Contemporary French Literature, History, Criticism, and Theory at the Collège de France, and the recipient of numerous awards and honors, both for individual publications and for his career achievements. And these are awards and honors conferred by institutions in and far beyond France. I'm not going to attempt to list them, as that would take a very long time, but instead I will mention only the singular honor bestowed on him in February when he was elected to fauteuil 35 of the Académie Française. So, yes. So this evening's talk and the reception that will follow it are really a wonderful occasion for us to celebrate that remarkable landmark in his career. As the title, The Proust Pandemic of 2022, perhaps suggests, in the last few months, the work, life, and times of Marcel Proust have been the object of a flurry of publications and exhibitions, timed to mark the 150th anniversary of Proust's birth in 1871 and the centennial of his death in 1922. At more or less the same time, the COVID pandemic, with its lockdowns and confinements, has created an occasion for some of us to return to Proust and to undertake the kind of slow and patient reading that his writing invites. It's not surprising that Antoine Compagnon has been a prime mover in the Proust pandemic. He is one of the leading specialists of Proust, and correspondingly, Proust has occupied a central place in his body of work. Over the course of his career, Antoine has explored a vast range of questions in literary theory and history, addressing both specialists and, through his popular radio and book series, Un été avec, a much more general readership. He has also distinguished himself as an editor, directing numerous critical editions. But although Antoine's work has ranged widely, he has returned over and over to a small number of writers and topics: Montaigne, Baudelaire, the literary culture of the Third Republic, and of course Proust. His studies of Proust include Proust entre deux siècles, published with Seuil in 1989, and editions of Du côté de chez Swann, Sodome et Gomorrhe, and most recently, the Pléiade volume devoted to Proust's non-fiction writing. In the last few months, Antoine has also been the curator or co-curator of two major Paris exhibitions. In the spring and summer, he directed Marcel Proust, Du côté de la mère, an examination of the Jewish culture and identity that Proust inherited from his mother, at the Musée d'art et d'histoire du Judaïsme. In conjunction with this exhibition, Antoine published with Gallimard a study of these same questions entitled Proust du côté juif. The second exhibition, which you see here behind us, which opened just a few weeks ago at the BNF, is Marcel Proust, La fabrique de l'œuvre, an exhibit in which Proust's manuscript occupies center stage, and that guides visitors through the complexities of the composition of À la recherche du temps perdu, from the preparatory notes for Du côté de chez Swann in 1906 to the posthumous publication of Le temps retrouvé in 1927. This exhibit, which showcases the Fonds Proust of the BNF, builds on decades of scholarship and is accompanied by a catalogue also authored by Antoine Compagnon. So obviously there's a great deal to talk about and much to look forward to in this presentation. So please join me in welcoming Antoine Compagnon.
Thank you, Madeleine. It's very nice to be with you tonight to celebrate and to discuss Proust, except that I have a cold and that I've been in bed most of the Thanksgiving weekend, but I've been testing negative every day, in every day of the last week, so I think that you should not worry. The picture that you have here is a picture I took 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was in Paris, in the subway of the exhibition that is now taking place, as Madeleine said, at the Bibliothèque nationale. And I like it because readers of Proust know that the subway is an important place in the novel. During World War I, in Le Temps Retrouvé, the subway is where people go when Paris is under the German bombs. And at the same time, it's the place where there is proximity, intimity, because life goes on even when there's a war. And life meaning that people meet, that people mix in the subway. So I liked this image, which leads to the direction of Proust, and which I think is a good introduction to the topic I want to discuss tonight, which I call the Proust pandemic of 2022. Proust died on November 18, 1922, so to speak, last week. And this has been a crazy year for a number of people, in particular for me. I have to confess that I've been astounded by the amount of celebrations, events, publications, exhibitions, readings of Proust in France, but everywhere. I didn't expect it. I don't think that we who are scholars of Proust had in mind that such an apotheosis of our writer would take place this year, and it's not completely over, although I look forward to the end of 22 so that I can do something else than Proust. It started slowly in 2021, as Madeleine said. Proust was born in July 1871, so there were 2 celebrations in succession. We celebrated his birthday. He was 150 in 2021, and then we celebrated his death. In fact, it started slowly in 2021, and I was surprised by the acceleration at the beginning of 22, and the way it became a sort of tsunami, a Proust tsunami, of which I will give you a couple of examples in the last weeks. In fact, I am very glad that I escaped these 2 last weeks in Paris, because I would have been busy every day with a number of events that I didn't necessarily wanted to be part of. Last week, for instance, these 2 marble tablets were installed in the building where Proust lived, Rue de Courcelles, from 1900 to 1906, and another one on the building where he died on November 18, 1922. This was done last week. I was invited. I could not have avoided going because it would have been understood as some sort of disapproval. And I could say, but I'm in New York. So it was very nice. Before that, there were already tablets in these two buildings. The building where Proust was born in 1871, Rue La Fontaine in Auteuil, and where he lived from 1907 to 1919, Boulevard Haussmann, which is now a bank and which is where most of the research was written. So now there are 4 buildings in Paris with these Mambon tablets, and I think that it might be a bit too much. On the building where he died, there was already one of those, what are called in French, pelles Stark, because they were designed by Stark, the Stark shovels, which described the fact that Proust died in that building, Rue Hamelin. And of course, last week there were flowers added by the Société des Amis de Proust. I'm of course a member of that society and even of the board of that society, so I couldn't have avoided being there. And last Friday, the 18th, this is the tomb at the Père Lachaise with all those flowers and the portrait. We were all invited to be there, I think, by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who gave one of those flowers. Of course, you see that one is given by the famille de Marcel Proust, another, yes, by la maire de Paris, Anne Hidalgo, and the Société des Amis de Marcel Proust. I found this picture this morning, checking what I could show you, and I was so ashamed that there was Proust du côté de chez Swann, préface d'Antoine Compagnon, and someone just put the edition of Swann's Way with a Madeleine and some stones on Proust's tomb. So the only name that is associated with Proust on the tomb is mine. I'm so glad that I didn't have to see that, and that I was here didn't have to witness this climax of the celebration. Last Monday or Tuesday, there was on the French TV, there was this show called La Grande Librairie, which is the only literary show on broadcast on the French TV. I was invited. I would have been there, sitting for 2 hours, just saying a few words about Proust that would have been quite nonsensical because it was basically entertainment, with this logo, tous Proust, everyone for Proust. Je suis Proust. So we are all Proust. Which means that there seems to be nowadays a consensus around Proust. Proust for everybody, Proust for all. And this unanimity didn't always exist. A couple of days ago, I was working on Colette to forget Proust, and saw that sentence by Marguerite Duras, who didn't like Colette, and Marguerite Duras said, je ne veux pas l'unanimité. I don't want unanimity. Je ne suis pas Colette. And she wanted to be contentious. There was a time when Proust was contentious, but apparently this is no longer the case. We are now in a moment of unanimity, and this means, of course, also that most of the rest of French literature is ignored, can be ignored. All the contemporaries, that fabulous generation of authors who were born around 1870, Valéry, Claudel, Gide, Peggy, Colette, I probably forget one or two. They are no longer read. Everything is around Proust for this year and probably for a while. This is surprising, and it's not what I expected, for instance, 30 years ago. At that point, I remember writing in the Lieu de Mémoire by Pierre Nora, the collection, the series of Pierre Nora, translated as Realms of Memory, that for many years Proust had been contentious, that for generations he had been read, for instance, in spite of the fact that he was Jewish or half Jewish and homosexual. And then came a time when, in the 1960s or 1970s, Proust started being read because he was Jewish and homosexual. So now, in the contemporary consensus, I'm not sure what's the situation. If he can be read at the same time, in spite of and because of. In any case, this Proust pandemic of this year has been totally unexpected by those who have been working on Proust for many years and who are not sure that the pandemic increases the number of readers of Proust. So I've been involved, so of course I'm guilty. I'm responsible for that pandemic, as Madeleine said, because I published 2 books on Proust in 2022, and I curated 2 exhibitions on Proust. So it's part of my fault, but still not expecting the result. This is the exhibition at the Bibliothèque nationale. Last Friday, the day of Proust's death, November 18, the entrance was free on that day, and you can see that it was more or less like in the subway in Paris, the number of people in the first room of the exhibition. If you remember the death of Bergotte in La Prisonnière, they buried him, but all through the night of mourning, in the lighted windows, his books arranged 3 by 3 kept watch like angels with outspread wings, and seemed, for him who was no more, the symbol of his resurrection. This passage has always seemed to me very kitsch, the idea of the angels with the books compared to the angels spread open like the wings in the bookshop. Well, we are witnessing this kitschification of Proust this year on a scale that was totally unexpected. This is the first exhibition which I committed, Marcel Proust du côté de la mère, mère, the mother, not the sea, not Balbec. This was at the Jewish Museum with a number of treasures like this, such as this letter, which is also the cover of my book, Proust du côté juif, a letter that nobody had ever seen before, where Proust says to Montesquieu, cher monsieur, si je n'ai pas répondu hier à ce que vous m'avez demandé des Juifs, if I didn't respond yesterday to what you asked me about the Jews, C'est pour cette raison si simple. It's for this very simple reason. Si je suis catholique, comme mon père et mon frère, par contre, ma mère est juive. Vous comprenez, etc. If I am Catholic, like my father and my brother, par contre, on the contrary, my mother is Jewish. You will understand that you should not speak the way you did in front of me ever again. Of course, this is a very violent letter. Many people were surprised who had never seen it, were surprised to see it, and I want you to notice a couple of details on that letter. The C that Proust uses, this is how he writes C in his very formal signature when he signs. When he signs on his contract with Gallimard, for instance, the formal C of Proust. And this is the C that he uses because it's very frontal, it's very aggressive, the way he writes to Montesquieu. And of course, the expression par contre, with the same C. When I was at school, we were taught to never use par contre, which is not correct in French. You should say en revanche, never par contre. So when Proust says par contre and not en revanche, he knows very well what he's doing. Par contre is truly offensive when you use it. Another few details of this exhibition, some beautiful paintings that we showed at the Jewish Museum. The Bellini Mohammed II, to whom Swann compares Bloch at the beginning of Swann's Way, which was loaned by the National Gallery to the Jewish Museum in Paris. We asked for it, not expecting that the National Gallery would loan it, because the Jewish Museum in Paris and the National Gallery in London are not exactly in the same league. If the National Gallery gave the painting, it's obviously because of Proust. They thought they couldn't say no to this request. And of course, I liked very much this caillebotte, which came from Holland. So there were a number of pieces that we could never have received if it were not because of the stature of Proust from museums which wouldn't lend to the Jewish Museum in Paris and which didn't lend in the past. This is at the Bibliothèque nationale, these paintings, the Hubert Robert, which we show at the Bibliothèque nationale. This painting, there's a famous scene which involves this water jet in Sodom and Gomorrah, in the garden of the Princess of Guermantes, where a woman approaches too close and there's some wind and she's showered by the jet d'eau. The jet d'eau had been at the Élysée Palace since 1973. It's a Louvre painting, but it was at the Élysée, loaned at the Élysée. It hadn't left the Élysée since 1973. So I had to write to the President of the Republic and ask him if now that the painting had been at the Élysée for 50 years, couldn't we have it for 3 months? And he couldn't resist this request. And of course, what I like most is for my students know that for 2 weeks in the course of the semester, I had to return to Paris because of the installation of the exhibition at the Bibliothèque nationale. And I took a number of pictures of the installation, which I like. So this one of the famous Jacques-Émile Blanche painting, which is at the Orsay Museum, while we were installing the first room of the exhibition where it figures. This is a very precious small notebook where Proust took notes. In particular, this is a page where he had a detective follow Agostinelli, his driver, secretary, love object. So he wanted to know what Agostinelli did, how he spent his time when he was not with Proust. And these are the notes of the detective in this small notebook. We had to fight in order to show it at the Bibliothèque nationale because they didn't have a case. We wanted to show it on a wall in a small case. They didn't have one, and of course you need to save money, so you can't have a case built just to show. And fortunately, they found one that they had used for an Asterisk exhibition a couple of years ago. So thanks to Asterix, we could show this notebook. And this I like because you see how people work when they install. These are the very famous galleys of Swansway that belong to the Bodmer Foundation in Geneva. The day they came from Geneva, and we were discussing with the curators of the Bodmer Foundation before hanging them on the wall. This I like too because it's something I had to insist in order to get. This piece of furniture comes from the Louvre. It's an empire, and if you remember, the Duchess de Guermantes loves the style of the empire, and in particular, pieces of furniture that have incrustations of wedgwood. And I'd never seen it. I wanted to see it, and the Louvre also accepted to give us. And they're a very beautiful kaleidoscope. Proust often compares the movement of society to the pieces of a kaleidoscope. Of course, a kaleidoscope in the 19th century was a beautiful optical device made in Germany. And probably, I'm not sure, visitors realize that where we have a treasure, which is a photograph. This is the photograph I took when it was first found of Geneviève Strauss, the model of the wit of the Duchesse de Guermantes, which belongs to the famous albums that Ludovica Lévy, the scrapbooks of Ludovica Lévy. So there you have Geneviève Strauss, the widow of Georges Bizet, the mother of the daughter of Fromental Lévy, the composer of La Juive, and the mother of Jacques Bizet, Proust's friend at the Lycée Condorcet. And you have, nobody had ever seen that picture before. In those shows, there are many pieces that nobody had ever seen before. It would have been nice to be able to place an asterisk on the labels, but of course, you can't do that. What I like also is those details when we were installing the famous Cercle de la Rue Royale, where you have Charles, the model of Swann, and the inspection of the painting by someone from the Bibliothèque nationale when it comes from Orsay to be sure that there won't be any alterations. And the painting when a couple of minutes later when it was installed. There you have Charles, the model of Swann, in this James Tissot painting of the Cercle de la Rue Royale, which is on the Place de la Concorde, where you have the Hôtel de la Ministère de la Marine, and the other side, the Automobile Club. And nowadays, and it's a great picture because Swann is at the same time belongs to the circle, La Rue Royale, belongs to the club, but he's an outsider. He's at the door, he's at the window. So Manet, this I wanted to show you too. This is a dress for Madame Swann from Jacques Doucet. So it was very costly to show it at the Bibliothèque nationale because it's too fragile to be, as they say, mannequiné. You can't show it standing because of its condition. So it means you really have to have a huge case to show it. But it's one of the most beautiful objects that we show at the Bibliothèque nationale. And I wanted to show you a long patrol because this is the patrol where we see the word patrol under this folded piece of paper that will be glued over patrol. There you have the word patrol. And we have many discussions on this word patrol. What does it mean? Proust uses patrol. We use patrol to describe these very long glued pages that Proust glues in his notebooks. So when you open the notebook, there is it can be 1.5 meters of folded pages that are glued together, and then upon them you have other editions that are glued. So this is what some of the most precious things. And Proust says that the word patrol is the word that he borrowed from Française, his maid. And patrol, probably for Française, meant all paper stuff. She said all the patrol that surround your bed. He worked in his bed, so the bed was full of patrol, which means papers, papeterie. But in the jargon of the Proustians, the patrol became the collage. And we always hesitate between writing patrol with one L of two L's, patrol. And there you have Proust writing it with two L's. This is another beautiful dress. This is from Venice, from Fortuny. It's probably the most rewarding moment in the curating of this exhibition at the Bibliothèque nationale was going to the Palais Galliera, which is the museum of vêtements, dresses, to choose what we would show in the exhibition. And so with the ladies who take care of the dresses, we chose that Fortuny dress, which could be mannequiné, that one, could be shown. But one of the pleasures of the exhibition was certainly the Palais Galliera. This is less pleasurable. I insisted that the labels should be the more discreet they could be, and so they were transferred as transferred labels, and the result I will show you was a bit problematic. This is how it works. These transfers. as you see, the accent of côté is missing. We realized doing that most of the accents didn't stick when these labels were transferred, and you can see how they looked. All the accents had to be added afterwards, and which means that the 2 last days before the opening were devoted to adding accents to the labels and checking that all the accents were present. This is what a curator does, I guess, but for me it was the first experience, and doing it twice in the same year was a bit too much. So as I said, this is an introduction to this consensus around Proust that we have encountered in this year, which takes us very far from, let's say, my first introduction to Proust, which is this one. This is Daniela Lévy. Daniela Lévy, who was with Proust at the Lycée Condorcet, speaking of Proust in 1962. So he was 90-something, and this is a couple of months before his death. And he is describing Proust in the Lycée Condorcet when they were teenagers in the 1880s. And I like very much this. It comes from a film that I recommend that you can see on YouTube called Proust Souvenir, which was shown on the French TV in 1962, in February 1962, I think. There was only at that point one channel on the French TV, so you couldn't avoid seeing it that evening. Oh, this is Daniela Lévy describing Proust.
À Paris, Proust était allé au lycée Condorcet. Chez Daniela Lévy, il fut son condisciple.
Oui.
Comment était l'enfant Proust?
Il est si singulier que j'hésite à vous répondre. Il était bien là, du lycée, et il ne semblait pas qu'il fût tout à fait des nôtres. Je me souviens d'un jour causant avec quelques camarades, je sentis quelque chose qui me touchait l'épaule. Je tournai la tête, c'était Proust. Je fis un mouvement un peu brusque et je me souviens qu'il se produisit une altération des traits sur le visage de Proust. Je lui avais fait de la peine. Ce que je pensais, avec un peu d'agacement, je crois que je pensais quelquefois qu'il était un peu poseur. Eh bien, je me trompais. Il était tout d'un coup triste, parce qu'il sentait tout d'un coup que tous ces garçons, oui, nous tous nous étions des garçons, lui était autre chose. Nous avions dans la classe un Sardou, un Bizet, un Robert de Fer, un Fernand Greg, et nous savions bien que premier dans cette petite catégorie d'êtres, il y avait Proust. Nous le savions. Nous avions organisé une revue au sortir du lycée Condorcet qu'on avait appelé le banquet, et naturellement nous avions demandé à Proust d'en être. Et Proust n'avait pas refusé dans sa gentillesse, et il nous avait donné une copie. Nous l'avions lue avec une surprise horrifiée. Nous devions la refuser. Qu'est-ce qui était arrivé? Quel malheur! Le malheur, on en savait des nouvelles. c'est que Proust était devenu homme du monde.
So this was Proust in 1962, far from the consensus of today. Daniel Lévy died just a couple of months after the broadcast of this TV show. And this is in fact the first Proust I knew. I read Proust in 1965. 1965, this was only less than just 50 years after Swann's Way was published. More time has gone by since that first reading of Proust and the sort of universal Proust that we know now. At that point, reading Proust still implied a choice, a decision. Nowadays, everybody knows about the Madeleine. Everybody knows about Longtemps je me suis couché de bonne heure. All reading is rereading, Nabokov said. One cannot read a book, one can only reread it. And this is the case with Proust, I would say, in a dramatic way. At the time, I read Proust because Proust, the only reason is that Proust became available in paperback. Up to that time, Proust was not easy to access. But suddenly, Proust was published in this beautiful collection of Le Livre de Poche with the design by a famous designer, Pierre Faucheux. These books appeared in 1965, so suddenly everybody could read Proust, who until then had been really
I'm not touching anything.
what's going on?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
Had been read only in a sect, a very small sect of Proustians. Suddenly, he became available for everybody. And you see these, in these beautiful covers, for instance, this notebook. This is the famous notebook number 1, where Proust took notes in 1908, the first notes for the Recherche. I edited this notebook in the 1980s, so it's always very moving to see it when I saw it in 1965. Of course, I had no idea I would later publish this notebook. But these were very beautiful collections. Of course, this was the generation of the paperback. If you remember Godard's famous film, Pierrot Fou, which starts in the bathroom with Belmondo reading a book with everyone of my generation recognizes, which is L'Histoire de l'Art by Elifort. We all had that book, the generation of the paperback. And this is in the first images of Pierrot Fou. The first change in the reading of Proust came with the paperback, with the generation of the paperback. And the real turning point, the moment when Proust became read much more commonly was, in fact, around the first centennial of his birth, 1971. It's in 1971 that things really changed, and that Proust, who had been read, I would say, by a limited number of people, suddenly became available for everybody. 1970, 1971. Yes, I want to insist on the fact that when Proust became available in the mid-1960s, this was due to a man, the director of the Livre de Poche, who was no other than Bernard de Fallois, who had edited Jean Santeuil and Contre Sainte-Beuve in the early 1950s. So he is the one who is responsible for giving to my generation Proust, the possibility to read Proust. And of course, we cannot forget that Bernard de Fallois also belonged to a radical right. He was a very conservative and even quite reactionary person, which means that the other books that we read at the same time as Proust were Brasiliac, the collaborator who was the main collaborator who was executed in 1945 with his two novels, his Histoires du cinéma with Maurice Bardèche, and of course with Maurice Barrès, Le culte du bois, introduced by Henri Massis, a major member of the Action Française. I say this because this is to remind you of the fact that the Proust of 1965 belonged to the right. Still, he hadn't yet been appropriated, I would say, by the moderns, by the left. The Proust of 1965 was still the property of almost of an aristocratic and upper bourgeoisie sect. Then I read those two books, and I want only to insist on this one. Gilles Deleuze, Marcel Proust et les signes, which shows us the moment where things change around Proust. This is the first edition, 1964. You see that it is still called Marcel Proust et les signes, and not Proust et les signes. We could say that it's the moment when Proust becomes a brand and people drop the first name and use only Proust. As you noticed, Halévy said, Halévy calls him Proust and not Marcel, as we used to do, as we still used to do when I was in a French lycée. We never used the first names. So Marcel Proust et les signes is a moment where we can understand that the shift is taking place and Proust is appropriated by many more people. 1971 is when I bought my old Pléiade, which I would later replace with a new one. But 1971 is when I bought the old Pléiade. And of course, it's a crucial year in the reception of Proust, because we had the edition of Jean Santeuil in the Pléiade, the edition of Contre Sainte-Beuve in the Pléiade, which I also replaced last year, the beginning of the edition of the correspondence by Philippe Kolb, and by Philippe Kolb again, the series Proust, textes retrouvés. So it's really the beginning of serious scholarship on Proust around 1970, the first centennial. Many books published in 70, 71, which really mark the change. Jean-Yves Tadier, Proust et le roman, the first thesis on Proust, Henri Bonnet, and Maurice Bardèche, Proust romancier, Maurice Bardèche, who is the brother-in-law of Robert Brasiliac. The first serious scholarly essay on Proust manuscripts is written by the brother-in-law of Robert Brasiliac, which still demonstrates the group to whom Proust belongs in those years. And by the way, it's a great book, which made a number of excellent hypotheses on the writing of the Recherche, which we still accept, namely the fact that Proust wrote in a very experimental way, by trial and error, fragments that he would shift, move around until he found the exact right place for those fragments. Yes, I wanted to mention that beautiful letter of Proust, which is a souvenir. I read it with Philippe Kolb, this letter. The last time I saw Philippe Kolb, who was one of the most eminent Proust scholars, who was a professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana, and this was in 1992. We were together in front of that letter that was in a showcase before an auction. And yes, no, I will read you the letter because I remember reading it with him. And of course the letter is now quite famous, but it shows you who was Proust and what was the context of his family. I can read it, but you can read it in English. This is my translation, so it's probably not very good. He writes to his grandfather. I have come to claim from your kindness the sum of 13 francs that I wanted to ask from Mr. Nathan, who is a cousin, but that Maman prefers that I ask from you. I needed so much to see a woman in order to cease my bad habits of masturbation that Papa gave me 10 francs to go to the brothel. But first, in my emotion, I broke a chamber post, 3 francs. Second, in that same emotion, I could not do it. Therefore, I am now, as before, waiting more by the hour, 10 francs to empty myself, and in addition, these 3 francs for the pot. But I dare not ask again money from Papa so soon, and I hope that you would come to my rescue in this circumstance, which, as you know, is not only exceptional, but also unique. It does not happen twice in one's life that one is too troubled to be able to do it. So, I remember reading it with Philippe Kolb, and this tells us so much about the society in which Proust was raised, in which this was discussed in the family between father, mother, grandfather, but not the first cousin, Mr. Nathan. We won't ask the first cousin, but the rest of the family would do it. Of course, in 1971, there was also a very beautiful exhibition already. There have been many exhibitions of Proust. This one was at the Museum Jacques Marandré. This is the first one I saw. So you can compare. In 1971, there was one exhibition at Jacques Marandré. This year we had 3 in Paris. One at Carnavalet, one at the Judaïsme Museum, and one at the Bibliothèque nationale. Of course, in between scholarship started, and again, I am probably a bit responsible for what I think has been a sort of lack of interest in Proust after we published the Pléiade, the new Pléiade in the late 1980s, a new edition of the Pléiade on which we worked for a number of years, which perhaps didn't help the reading of Proust. And I will just remind you of what Roger Shattuck said of our edition of the late 80s. The esquisses add up to some 1,250 pages, equal to almost half the length of the novel itself. 8 inches on the shelf instead of 3. Is there someone somewhere who believes that this elephantiasis is appropriate to Proust's novel? 3,000 pages are daunting enough. What past mistakes or what new discoveries explain this more than doubling of the product we are to pay for and hold in our hands? Other shorter, far less expensive and fully satisfactory editions in French and English await one in the bookstores. Nevertheless, Proust scholars working with the original French have generally elected the new 7,000 plus page Pléiade as the authoritative version to be cited. A number of people thought that our edition of Proust was monstrous, an elephant on a butterfly, to take the image of Nabokov. And I responded to Shattuck, but I admit that our editions have been daunting and that for many years it didn't help the reading of Proust. It took many years to get over our scholarly edition. I can give you one example of this. In the first volume of the New Pléiade, the same draft is given twice. Once as a draft of Swann's Way, and once as a draft of À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs, within the budding grove. 2 different editors gave the same draft for a passage which concerns Bergotte, the imaginary writer. A number of years ago, I was lecturing at the Collège de France on Bergotte. I gave a series of lectures on Bergotte, and I noticed this blunder. I thought I told the director of the Pléiade. I probably didn't, because last spring we had a conversation on our Pléiade and on the opportunity to have another one, to do a new one. The first one was done in 1954. It lasted until 1987, 89. 35 years or so, so it would be time to replace us. I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't do it, but I wouldn't mind if a new Pléiade was done. So I told the director, yes, there would be, and I told him in volume 1, the same draft is given twice. And he told me, nobody ever wrote us to tell them. This is what he wrote me. 100,000 volumes have been sold in 35 years. Il est tout de même frappant. It is striking that we never receive any letter from any reader on noticing that, which shows that probably our Pléiade was not what it should have been. So what I'm satisfied about in 2022 is that we have got over the sort of obstacle that we created with the new Pléiade, and there's a flurry of good books that have been published in 2022. It's what I would have said in June. After the first part of 2022, many good books were published. I will very quickly go through some of them. Biographies of Reynaldo Hahn, of Céleste Albaré, of Agostinelli, my book on Proust. American books, the book of Saul Friedlander, William Carter, Proust in Love, Prendergast, Living and Dying with Proust. Another series of books, which are all good and interesting. These are editions, critical editions of the drafts, les 75 feuillets, letters, Le Temps Perdu, the first. These are all interesting and good books. Of course, I have to mention my edition of the essays, and you see it, this edition, on the desk of Emmanuel Macron. a couple of in September I had to be received by the President of the Republic, because you're not truly elected at the Académie Française until an audience by the head of state, who is the protector of the Académie Française. This was Louis XIV, Napoleon, and now Emmanuel Macron. So I thought it would be nice to offer him something, and I gave him the edition of the Marcel Proust, of the essays, when I went to visit him in September. And he opened the gift and said, "Oh, je ne l'avais pas encore." I didn't have it yet, which I thought was very nice, but then he left it on his desk. And the week after, it was Heritage Day, and I received all these messages from people who had seen it on Facebook, on Twitter, on the desk of Emmanuel Macron. I thought that he should have taken it on the plane coming to the UN, because this was just before coming to the UN. I think Mitterrand would have taken it on the plane, and we would have a picture of François Mitterrand reading the essays and not standing on the desk. But I'm sure he will do it the next time. So I say that these are the three catalogues of the three exhibitions. I say that many good books were published in the first part of the year. I'm not sure that in the second part of the year it's as interesting, because, as I said, there has been a tsunami, and this is the fall. And in this tsunami, people have been riding the wave. There are books on Proust that are published every week. This is what I had received when I was in Paris 3 weeks ago. And these are books that I haven't received, that I've seen that they were published last week. So you see 2 coffee table books on Proust and the arts for the holidays, and of course the important Reynaldo Hahn journal, which was published last week, and the collection of one of the great Proust collectors. But this is really the tsunami, and I hope that this will make people read Proust. I'm not absolutely sure, but when we were installing the show at the Bibliothèque nationale, I had a conversation with the workers who were installing Proust. They were very curious about Proust. They were very curious about the number of manuscripts, galleys, and Proust that we were showing, and I hope that they will read Proust after having installed the show, and that there will be more readers of Proust after this somehow a bit excessive year of celebration. Thank you. Yes, but I've been much too long, I'm sure. But yes, of course. Any questions?
So maybe I can start. I was very interested by what you said at the beginning of your talk about the consensus and the possibility that today Proust is read both because and in spite of. And I'm wondering, given the trajectory that you showed us from the right-wing Proust to a more left-wing Proust, if you think that the consensus is a neutralization of politics, or if those different currents still exist in the reading of Proust. I'm thinking, of course, here, no such, people become consensus figure, and then that consensus is, in the US, is demolished. So I'm just wondering what that means politically.
Well, as you might have guessed, I hope that Proust will become contentious again. In the 19th century, it was often said that French literature didn't have a writer that represented the spirit of the nation. No Dante, no Shakespeare, no Cervantes, no Goethe, no Pushkin. There was no way to epitomize French literature in a single writer. You had Corneille and Racine, Voltaire and Rousseau, Hugo wouldn't fit, Molière wouldn't fit, Montaigne wouldn't fit. And now, it seems to be Proust who fills that role. But of course, the idea of a writer representing the spirit of a nation is completely outdated. So there's something that doesn't fit in this consensus around Proust nowadays. I hope it will be broken. I don't know how. I don't know how the future generations will read Proust. Of course, responding to you, I am thinking of our latest Nobel Prize, Annie Ernaux, who loves and hates Proust, who read Proust when she was very young. She always claims to come from a very low-class background. But she read Proust in the Pléiade, in the first Pléiade. I read it as a paperback. In any case, Annie Ernaux claims that Proust is unbearable because of the way he treats Française, the maid, on a point of view of class. A couple of weeks ago, there was a French magazine, a newspaper, that had as its title, Annie Ernaux, Proust est insupportable. So I sent her, I know her quite well, so I sent her a message telling her, please don't say that, I know that it's not true. I invited her twice to the Collège de France, where she spoke of Proust, and I like Annie Ernaux, so we get along well. But now she claims she is a bit more subtle, so she says that there are things that are unbearable in Proust when he deals with issues of class, and that he is, as her adjective is, I think, he is dismissive of Françoise, or things of that sort. So there are still people who think that Proust is unbearable, but who cannot live without Proust, as Annie Ernaux. But it's not bad, I think, to have a voice that broke the consensus of this year of celebration as she did. And in fact, last week, on November 18, the exact anniversary of the death of Proust, she spoke on the French radio, and it wasn't, I listened to it yesterday because I thought we might want to discuss it, and I still agree with her that there are ways in Proust, in the way he deals with the lower classes, that explain why, for a number of generations, he was the property of a limited number of people. So Proust can be contentious. I guess that at La France Insoumise, there are not that many readers of Proust. Except Mélenchon, who is a very learned and lettered person. I'm sure Mélenchon read Proust. Yes.
So I'm not sure I understand. If you asked Annie Arnaud not to say that Proust was insupportable,
Yes.
what do you mean when you say that you want to make Proust contentious again?
No, I want
what
to
does
be.
that mean?
I want people to be. I want Proust to be discussed. I want people to say that there are things in Proust that they don't like, that they don't agree with. I don't like the religiosity of Proust. I don't like. I'm not sure that I would defend the religiosity of the book. As I showed you the passage which I called kitsch on the death of Bergotte and the immortality of Bergotte, I'm not sure that these are things that I couldn't do without in Proust. As Duras said, je ne veux pas l'unanimité, je veux le contentieux. I think Proust can be contentious. Was for a long time. I think a great writer has to be contentious. Richard.
A simple question, a simple person. Can you recommend any good English translations?
English translation.
Well, for those of us who don't want to read 20 books.
There are two translations that are available. One is the original Scott Moncrief, which was revised by Kilmartin and Wright, and which is the one that when I use quotations, I gave you a quotation, I still use the Scott Moncrief revised because there were many misunderstandings in the Scott Moncrief. Initially, many passages that were difficult to understand. After having been revised 3 times, it is, I think, quite acceptable. And then there's the new one, which was directed by Christopher Prendergast, and which is now the Penguin translation. The other one is, forget who is the publisher. Modern Library. Modern Library is the other one. The Penguin. So the problem with the Penguin is that the 7 volumes were translated by different translators. And so there are some inconsistencies between the volumes. The first volume was translated by Lydia Davis, which I think is very good. The volume which I edited in French is Sodom and Gomorrah. The translator, of course his name I forget, was the editor of the TLS. I stupidly forget his name. Who did Sodom and Gomorrah. I think it's a good volume. He consulted me. We exchanged, but I think it's unequal. The Prendergast edition. It's good. It's good. Of course, then I have to tell you that in the shows, both the Nationale and the Jewish Museum, I chose the Prendergast edition because it's more modern. It's in a sense easier for a public. And also, I asked Prendergast if I could alter the translation.
And did he say yes?
What?
Did he say yes?
And he accepted. And I could make a couple of changes in the translation. So Prendergast is a friend, so it was easier to deal with him than with Scott Moncrief, who died centuries ago.
So is Prendergast the Penguin, or
Pendergast is penguin. Scott Moncrief is mother diary, if I'm not wrong. And there is another one that's coming.
I have one question. What influence did George Painter's biography have on Proust and the popularity?
George Painter. I should have mentioned it. It was in my notes. George Painter's biography was published in 1962 in English, I think 1965 in French. It's really an important turning point because it's those years, as I said, where there was a move in the reception of Proust from the right to the left, as I would say. It coincided with the death of all the witnesses. In the early 60s, a number of people who had known Proust were still alive, but they fell one by one. And once they disappeared, you could really start reading Proust. You can really read a book when all the contemporaries are there. This is what Proust called the Saint-Beuve effect. You are constrained by the biography. So Painter's biography was very important. The first major one was one by André Mauroy in 1949 before and he refused to see the witnesses. So it's written without contact with all the friends, the relationships, of course. The problem is that he constantly uses the novel to write the biography. So it's now everybody, for instance, I will just give you one example because I discussed it in my senior seminar last week. In Guerlain's Way, the hero or the narrator says that his father didn't speak to him for 8 days after he signed the petition for Dreyfus. When you read George Painter says Proust's father didn't speak to him for 8 days because Proust signed a petition in favor of Dreyfus. And this is not in all of Proust's biographies. Every Proust biography says that Dr. Adrien Proust didn't speak to Marcel Proust for 8 days after he signed the petition for Dreyfus. Perhaps, but this is the sort of influence that Painter has had on, and we could cite many instances of this type. Of course, it's very good. It's a very good book. You can read it. It reads better than Bill Carter's biography or even Jean-Yves Tallier's biography, because they are more scholarly, less readable. So people will read it. But it has problems.
Hello. Do you still feel emotion at the passages that were your favorite passages?
At the what?
Do you still feel emotion reading the passages that were your favorite passages?
Do I feel emotions?
Yeah, emotion, yes.
Is it surprising? No, there are passages that make me cry whenever I read them. One passage is a famous passage. les intermittences du cœur, the intermittences of the heart when the hero what Proust calls la mort après coup de ma grand-mère, the death of my grandmother after the fact, when he returns to Balbec the second time, and the first night his grandmother is not there to help him unlace his boot, and he realizes he wasn't sad when she died, but much later he realizes what death is about. So it's a passage that I edited because it's in Sodom and Gomorrah, so I worked on the drafts, the notebooks, the sort of thing that you do when you are an editor, but I could never objectively work on that passage. Never. Whenever I returned to the draft, it was too moving to work scholarly on it. So there are many passages of that nature. And when you see at the exhibition, when you see the manuscripts, the drafts, the way Proust worked, I didn't show you too many pictures of drafts, but the exhibition at the Nationale, it's 2/3 manuscripts, and the rest is objects, painting, photographs, but 2/3 manuscripts. Proust's manuscripts are beautiful. They are works of art.
Where are they? Where are they kept?
The manuscripts at the Bibliothèque nationale. Yes, the manuscripts, the Fond Proust was bought by the Bibliothèque nationale in 1962 when the family, the niece of Proust, wanted to sell it to the University of Austin, the University of Texas and Austin. 1962, the University of Texas was very rich because of the oil boom in the early 60s, and at that point, France wasn't as poor as it is today, so it could buy the manuscripts. The check was signed by a young Secretary of Finance called Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. The President of the Republic was Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle thought that Proust shouldn't leave France. So this is why I worked on the manuscripts for probably 5 years at the Bibliothèque nationale. If I had to do it in Austin, I'm not sure that I would have